Hello everyone, today we introduce the figure of Raimondo Montecuccoli that we can't present plainly and simply. Actually, it could be done in different ways, but today we stress especially this aspect. It was the greatest thinker of the art of war between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz, right? And let's leave aside for a moment the fact that he saved Vienna, giving other 20 years after the Battle of the Rab in 1664 against the Ottomans to recover, because at that time Vienna was completely devoid of defenses. Right? It was not in 1683 where the defenses were, of course, inadequate, but they lasted till the relief force was gathered. Here, literally, we're talking about a single battle that changed probably in even more, given the odds. Right, in Vienna wasn't easy, but they had outstretched themselves in the entrenchments and the assaults of the city, and they left their left side, fairly unprotected. It was actually an amazing battle and very theatrical in many ways, very entertaining and picturesque. But the one of the Rab of Mogersdorf or St. Gotthard, wherever you want to call it, in this Middle European area where, of course, many names, many peoples that came to call it in their various historiographies, marked a dramatically important turn in Western history. And at the same time, Montecuccoli could be presented just, think about his biography. Right, a truly exceptional. He was a veteran in the 30 Years' War. He went through, think about his most famous rivalry with Turenne, about whom we will have to tell also a lot of things. Turenne is also one of those figures you can't really miss. We are expanding, as you know, from some 6 months only in this fields of 17th century warfare, a bit more in detail, and we have to frame very well all these various characters under the light they really deserve, right? I wonder, probably many of you actually know who Montecuccoli has been, right? And today I will not make a presentation of his figure, right? I really want to quote certain parts of his work, right? Of course, framing the man in his work, but not presenting him wholly as for the political or military relevance that he had, but just because of his thought, of his extraordinary work, right? Great generals. Think about Prince Eugen, who started a series on him. Achieved great things, but didn't leave much of written. Not even properly a legacy in terms of military institutions, did they? We're talking still of this big time of transition that Montecuccoli in many ways, especially from a theoretical point of view, embodies, because properly he's, as we have seen, the only great thinker of the same level for the times being, contextually, respectively, between Machiavelli, that is the Renaissance, and von Clausewitz, that is essentially, the Napoleonic era, post-Napoleonic, but I mean in the wake of that properly time of the art of war, between the Middle Ages, you could say. In Machiavelli's times, the Renaissance was born, but it was in a sense yet to be made, because most of Europe fundamentally functioned as it had always functioned during the Middle Ages. Also, from a military point of view, there were very few powers that could boast something greater, like France, like the Ottoman Empire, mostly. At the time of Montecuccoli, as we have seen also recently in the videos about the siege of, the 1683 siege of Vienna and all the diplomatic preparatory phase and all, the previous years, the Habsburgs, under which Montecuccoli and many other subjects, in this case from the Italian lands, served as generals. Montecuccoli was the Generalissimo, Feldmarschall, right, of a person of enormous power, just like Prince Eugen actually would become later on, and definitely one of the greatest generals in Austrian history. And yet we have seen, of course, as Habsburgic Austria was still without all its possessions. Let's say better that the possession of the Habsburgs, a very heterogeneous, very medieval-like still system. It wasn't a centralized state. Right, it wasn't anything like the France of Louis XIV that exactly in this time, we will read it because Montecuccoli was fascinated by it, as Prince Eugen, that was born actually and lived in France, and was French by education, definitely as a savoir carignano recognized. It had all the eyes of Europe pointed on France, right, and on the Sun King. And there was this realization, naturally, that in the broader competition between all these powers, and namely, the Habsburgs against the Bourbon at this point was definitely the most important clash during the 30 Years' War. That had been a big deal. As you know, basically the Catholics had won the war, then the Swedes first, but also the French massively, with Richelieu, that played the card very cleverly under Louis XIII, intervened in France, in Germany, and made the total mess. It also brought to the major devastations in the area we've seen still by 1683. So, almost 40 years after the Treaty of Westphalen, how the situation was not, of course, was very different after the war, but still the problem had not been solved, and France was keeping to expand dramatically at this point proper. With the military system, of course, was political and social alike, just like the Clausewitzian Trinity teaches us, that seemed unstoppable in many ways. Like the Ottomans had began to slow down because they had sweat and bled a lot, especially after the siege of Kandy. We can't speak properly about decline of the Ottoman Empire. The same Montecuccoli, and if he wrote that after having defeated the Turks at Schent Gotthard, he naturally captured all his train, their baggage. He looked, for example, his weapons at their gunpowder, and he realized, damn, these guys still make very good stuff. They're still very advanced. The myth that sometimes you read on some modern history manuals that the Ottoman Empire declined because it was fundamentally technological decline over the West, it's nonsense, right? It's completely debunked as a theory. That there is much more to say, that including the fact that the Ottoman Empire was basically constantly, fighting on 3 different fronts, right? And that costs a freaking lot, and this is also what properly we will see today, that you cannot have that military reform, you cannot have the process of centralization. Then in fact, before Prince Eugen here in Austria wouldn't happen. The same Montecuccoli actually couldn't do much about it at the end of the day. It cannot happen overnight, right? You need a specific political will, a certain amount of resources, a precondition that, however, we're all beginning to be realized also in an ever more scientific fashion. This is the time also the so-called scientific revolution, as we will see. We mostly know because of Newton, but the same Montecuccoli was a Galilean, right? He had a pretty important logical dialectical process in his writing. He objectively started to realize the importance of practice, not what was namely theoretically functional in the mind, like Machiavelli, that made this dramatic step of saying in order to rule a state you can also go against religion if it is for a greater good, right? There is a formal and continuistic aspect, pragmatic policy that makes in many ways Machiavelli a man of the Renaissance, not a medieval person like most of his contemporaries still were, if you really want to trace this categorization. With Montecuccoli, there is properly the realization that will be the same Clausewitzian one, that war must be studied on the base of experience. This is extremely important also relatively to our Vom Kriege series, right? Because, first of all, Montecuccoli wrote this astonishing amount of work, right? And Europe at the time translated immediately this enormous amount of written stuff in every language except English. And we should stress this just to say how actually Europe is one thing, and it is not also at some levels. Think how this culturally impacted certain aspects of the world, but Montecuccoli easily became the von Clausewitz of the 18th century. We have seen it just with Prince Eugen, that basically had been, in love with the works of Montecuccoli, that reasoned like Montecuccoli. He informed a whole generation of military leaders all over Europe, right? and not just as an authority. This is what I would like to stress. Not just like the name that Machiavelli had earned, for example, but also the case of Montecuccoli as a precursor of the method and of the analysis that would have been the one of von Clausewitz. Right? A lot of things that we will read today, quoting Montecuccoli, and we will see it expressly for this reason, are actually procuring what von Clausewitz said. Right? And von Clausewitz is pretty aware from Montecuccoli pro. And there is this quote that I will translate all the stuff from Italian, where these works are, but there are certain I will try to do it simultaneously, but there are certain passages beautiful to read, and the one that struck me in particular, it says, to persuade to make war, progress and conquest without fighting in the open and without coming to the battle, if it's not a contradiction in terms, it is at least a great paradox, right? Just think about what we just read a few days ago in the Vom Kriege playlist about the size of battle, right? About how this is in many ways the embryo of the Clausewitzian concept that a great battle is unavoidable. It's the combat and destruction is what war has to necessarily get down to, right? There is a huge human capital in here, right? Montecuccoli was definitely a great intellectual. It was told at the time, eventually also later on, with great admiration, continentally wide, that with his writings he rendered eternal basically what he had accomplished with his military deeds, on the field. Right. And it's even more important to stress, perhaps as a detail, but equally important that, and for completeness of information, that we have to thank the Habsburgs, right, that actually jealously concealed all this work, kept it, treasured it for decades, right, and eventually they allowed their publishing, right, of this, the work of their captain had remained a secret of state, because at the time it was thought, 17th century, this was an actual asset. Like, you wouldn't want your enemy to read what Montecuccoli had written, because it was conceived to be amazing, right? Just for the record, we will talk about this another time. I know it apparently has nothing to do with today's debate, but never think ever for 1 second that what was happening in the West at this point in terms of military theories, and it's even remotely comparable to anything that had ever happened in the world, right? There is unfortunately this, fashion, which is purely fashion, that think that, Sun Tzu or this broader Asian tradition, Far East Asia, there was all this mysticism / exoterism, whatever you want to call it, about their great wisdom and capacity. This has nothing to do. I mean, in a line of the advancement of human thinking, at this point, the West was producing something that nobody had ever seen, even at the time of Montecuccoli, but even at the time of Machiavelli, actually. And it lays within certain specific conditions in the West. It's not to say that, we're Westerners, we're better than yours. It's not the point. That's the point, that you cannot compare certain works, that there has been a huge popular distraction about, especially Sun Tzu, that is an extraordinary work, but it cannot be compared even remotely. You see these bankrupt, writers that, in order to sell a bunch of stuff on Amazon, write still this bullshit about, Machiavelli and Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz, right? As if it was, this great mysteries, who was best between the two. Like it's like composing, a philosopher, 19th century philosophy of the time, idealism, von Clausewitz, with a person that lived in the same time of Pythagoras, right? What do you think, that this exoteristic attitudes are just to prove that people who approach these topics or in this function actually do not know anything about it. So let's stick very seriously to what happened in the West, because that's fundamentally what matters. And just saying that the whole world today works on the base, all the militaries in the world are based on the Clausewitzian theory, including the Far East Asian ones, and as held they are, but also that there are roots that before von Clausewitz definitely stem from these crucial moments in Western history that, in the case of Montecuccoli, was naturally the 30 Years' War, and naturally also what happened afterwards with this also surpassing, of course, of the secular, spiritual dichotomy in many ways that, as we've seen, had begun with Machiavelli, but had fundamentally had been enhanced. Look, the 30 Years' War was the great confessional clash, the greatest confessional clash Europe ever faced in a single, war, or at least, it was actually some of it, but, the intensified, the sheer destruction. Germany was literally wiped, like 1/3 of the German population was wiped out by the plague and by the war. It was something that had never been seen. It's not surprising that, after the Napoleonic Wars, von Clausewitz emerged, and after the 30 Years' War, Montecuccoli emerged, and that they had been both generals in those wars, and that had been in the midst of the fray. They had seen the whole thing, and came to realize, to think, to articulate their thoughts, their theory, on a more scientific base, right? So, of course, the post-Westphalian Europe is something where the matter of separation of state and church had been settled, right? In many ways, we have seen many times also with the 1683 videos how, I don't know, but this happened since the time of the Valois, that France, of course, most Catholic and most powerful Christian power, excuse me for the game of words, was naturally siding with the Turks against the Habsburgs. And that for a good reason, right? I don't want you to follow me for funboistic reasons of, those are the good people or the bad people. Louis XIV was one of the smartest asses ever. Like, he definitely did that for France and for the power of France, and he did good. Hell, he did good. The Habsburgs were trying their best. The Ottomans were trying their best. The other powers were trying their best. And that's what, in a nutshell, also the history of civilization is, and why, the conflict produces civilization, right? Conflict, wars, destruction is the sub of civilization. But what we learned, in medicine after World War I, after the Vietnam War, just think about that. Or it's easily the Punic Wars, the rise of, it all starts from these dramatic moments in which everything is put under pressure, everything is put under discussion. This is the point, the critical ability to say, let's try to evolve from, in this time, something that was just seen as an authoritative past. Think about the Renaissance theories that were these delusions fundamentally of copying, how the Romans or the Macedonians fought like. And of course, while the practice of warfare, independently from what treatises wrote, went its own way anyhow, and that, of course, pike and shot warfare has basically, it comes to die basically in this time, second half of the 17th century, of course, had nothing to do with that. And because there is no parallelism between the Macedonian armies and the Renaissance pikes. They're just similar system, but they stem from completely different problems, completely different forces on the field, proportionally in different societies, easily, right? And of course, the Renaissance Europe and even late medieval Europe was dramatically more advanced than anything had ever seen in the ancient world. These thinkers now, and consider the problem of reasoning by authority. Here it's not something to joke with, right? These guys, Montecuccoli, of course, was a Catholic and fought as such during the 30 Years' War under the Habsburgs, with this very well. We will have to talk about it. It's with the careers. His cousin was already working for the Habsburgs, and he had him enlisted. These guys began. This was a fashion that spread in Catholic armies because of the way of the hidalgos in the Spanish tercio, that even the nobility had to start actually to the military service by fighting as pikemen alongside the common troopers. And this happened, and these people knew what it meant not to look from the thing from, at the distance, and remaining their aristocratic life and not caring about the rest. Of course, they had a huge a huge difference between the classes and so on, but they knew what it was to fight as a common soldier as much as the highest commander of the Habsburgic armies. Authority in a context of Protestantism, post-Tridentine, counter-reformistic situation from the Catholic side meant that you cannot really question authority. As we've seen, Montecuccoli was a Galilean. What did happen to Galileo? You know it. He was forced to, reject his own theories. Why? Because the Aristotelian Ptolemaic system that the Church had adopted as the standard scientific system. By the way, Galileo's work had actually been commissioned by the Pope. Right, so the thing is very much more complicated when it's usually told, and also, of course, Galileo believed in God and in the scriptures. But the point of authority at that point, from a political and social point of view, was greater than what the genius and the work even of just these great thinkers like Galileo could be a scientist, or Montecuccoli could be a or if we kept just about Machiavelli, that was his work was the Prince was put in the dark list of the Inquisition, of the papal censorship on the various books. But this is also proof that these thoughts couldn't be stamped. That what actually worked went on, right? And there would be also a lot to tell about history of science in this regard. But the idea of today we are used to say, I don't want to be excessively vulgar, but say to go against authority, you understand what I mean, right? By sheer principle, we teach essentially, to be always free. It doesn't matter, we don't rarely teach that the hierarchies are something good, that there is a meritocratic function, that sometimes they fail because people fail and they're weak and faulty in many ways, but that there is a civilization properly not in being in absolute freedom, in what you could call negative freedom, but in actual liberty, that is to say, to limit yourself for what it's functionally useful, right, for yourself and society as a consequence, right? And these are ideas that were being born exactly in these years, right? After Westphalen, the idea that you could, what your conscience pertains to your conscience remains on a level, and what pertains to what the law says on another, right? This was actually in the Christian thought, and very much in monotheism in many ways. But the idea is that society came objectively from a past in which there had never been something like people that didn't reason if not by authority. That had been the standard in every single age that had ever existed. So these people were really emerging and blossoming as thinkers, as philosophers, from a humus that was completely different, and that required this enormous intellectual courage to even say, we have to do even something wrong if we want to be right, right? And the point of just war, right? We've seen. This is still a context of crusade against the Ottomans. The Christians were fighting as crusaders. Those were waged by the papacy. It was officially so. It was all a formal bureaucratic thing about and it was definitely a spirit, a belief, right? That of course, in many ways, it went dispersed in the reality, in pragmatism, in the realpolitik that we could start talking about. Once again, see Louis XIV of France in his greatness, but that is new, and that is controversial. It's very edgy, actually, for the time being. So I really want you to frame this man in first of all in this background. Then we will talk one day about his biography, his military deeds, and all this stuff. But today we try to understand this also from reading some passages of his and realizing what was already in prototyping here that was developed eventually. And that is even at the base of the Clausewitz in thinking in many ways, right? This is of dramatic importance. Consider this, that Prince Eugen was taught ideally by Montecuccoli. Frederick II was taught, ideally, by Prince Eugen, with officers famously that fought during the War of Spanish Succession. You look at the siege of French siege of Turin. There were all Prussian officers in the Habsburgic armies that fought in Piedmont under Prince Eugen at that point. Frederick II, also one of the greatest, of course, commanders in modern age, and one of the greatest also thinkers in his own way. Not quite as these proper, theorists, but still, someone who went beyond in many ways. From Frederick II, we pass to Napoleon, and more properly, not that Napoleon was much of a thinker in this sense. I mean, he was a hell of a thinker in terms of genius, which he definitely was one of the greatest military minds of his times, but he didn't also write in that sense. But from that connection, the Prussian von Clausewitz, that of course had seen Frederick II's army defeated, right? Because, of course, by Jena Auerstedt, Frederick II was famously dead. Napoleon, when he entered Berlin, he went at I remember when it was already in Potsdam, where he's buried today. Visit the Sans Souci if you visit Berlin and go to Potsdam. I was there twice. I love Potsdam, and he said in front of his officers, my gentlemen, if this guy here, looking at the tomb of Frederick II, had been alive, we wouldn't be here now. Right? This is how much Napoleon credited him. And of course, Frederick II's army was defeated, though, properly at Jena Auerstedt, because albeit he was dead, all the generals that fought there lived still in the wake of his thoughts, of his concept, of the oblique order. Well, you know what I'm talking about. A bit of the same would happen after Napoleon, right? Just von Clausewitz stood out and said, wait a second, there is something more to that. And what, surpassed Napoleonic warfare in many ways was also, so you see the Prussian army reformed by 1870 on the Clausewitzian ideas. You see the chain of ideas here. You see the thing that from Montecuccoli to even the German unification, there is a specific fil rouge that connects the whole thing, right? This is the standards, the dimensions that we should start learning properly to reason like as Westerners, right? Because this is what not we have done, but this is this because individually we haven't done this, but we have been born in a civilization that allowed us better than others to understand what this was, right? And this was literally the most developed thing that was happening at the time. So if you say why Montecuccoli is important, and now we will see also certain other aspects, right? So we could easily say that the second half of the 17th century was dominated by Montecuccoli in terms of military literature, right? He was general, great soldier, we would say, but also great writer, as we've seen. Generalissimo of the imperial army, right, and winner of the Turks on the Rab in 1664, and most famous antagonist of the French General Turenne on the Rhine, right? Who's better, Montecuccoli or Turenne? There's great debate in the 17th century warfare. And by the way, the campaigns of Montecuccoli and Turenne on the Rhine are basically one of the most, fundamental lessons in strategy that you can ever, read. You know how it ended. Turenne was smashed actually by a cannonball. Montecuccoli was extremely sad about it, and he also didn't, go particularly heavy on the French on that occasion as well. Even there, the thing is ambiguous, but this is also a time in which chivalry counted. Montecuccoli was a nobleman. You know what the career was in the sense. He was from northern Italy. He came, that was naturally an imperial fief, so he came to make a career for the Habsburgs in Austria and so on. It was the normal thing for these nobles. And so the ideological and textual elaboration of Montecuccoli's work that began to study in this fascinating concept in Stettin, 1639, was very young. He was a prisoner in there, right? He had been captured by the Swedes during the 30 years where he spent this time in prison, and he began to write the stuff. And all these elaboration was very long, extremely, I would say, long and complex, right? He started from this wide phenomenological meditation on the various clashes and coming to embrace in the great, in Italian, it's Trattato della Guerra, which means Treaty of War, the Treaty of War, right? Was published in 1642. At the end of a long and very, as we've seen, also fruitful Swedish prisoning, and the entire phenomenon war, we could say. This is already, think about the horizons of this meditation, it's very important. And here, even in the greatest, the utmost respect, and in the most profound knowledge of both ancient and modern military literature, Montecuccoli's practical sense and his experience of old soldier, even though he was just barely more than 30 years old, made him state that, quote, the practice is master of all things. And, usually there is a difference between what we presuppose theoretically and what instead presupposes the practice. It was entails, if you want. And also that was a way both to enter in the discourse of experimentation that was exactly in this time with the scientific revolution, revolutioning the sciences, the letters, and the arts altogether, right? Here's the whole continent is putting itself in motion. But also the famous Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes that was splitting in two halves, let's say the battlefields of philosophers. You know, what this means is that that problem of authority we're saying before, that is, you know, do we really have just to stick to what the ancients said? You know, the Europeans at this point were literally obsessed about what the ancients had done. It was their fixed model, right? Just at this point, someone began to say, as Montecuccoli, wait a second, right? You know, those guys might have been, you know, whatever we have made the myth of them, but what happens on the battlefield, and I have seen that, many other people have seen that from first-hand experience, is something different, and we cannot think that there's just the classical world to look at when you study war properly. In the treatises, consider that there was also an enormous divide, usually between those who wrote treatises and the soldiers. In the sense, it's very rare to find someone that had both a direct military experience and was just trying to copy some classical text that was being, you know, philologically, more famous than had been in the past. It was being restarted, revived, let's say. This is why Montecuccoli is definitely a true and extraordinary son of the 17th century. Surely one of the greatest, there is no doubt about this, also in the intellect, in many ways. And Montecuccoli had this unprejudiced opening that is truly experimental in 17th century, like in his great works that followed eventually, such as the L'Arte Militare on the military art in 1653, and especially the most famous aphorisms of the Aphorismi dell'arte bellica of 1670, so the aphorisms of the military art, the art of war, that knew how to modify his positions under the light of his experience, and at the same time to abstract the latter in order to research through, you know, very tortuous and somewhat also misleading but still fundamental paths of practical reality, of a correct theorization of general norms, right? This is also what von Clausewitz fundamentally searched and actually, you know, tried and achieved in his times. Montecuccoli is naturally living in a moment of passage, so there is also a specific dialectical method, a scientific realization. We cannot compare a scholar, an author of the 17th century with one of the 19th, right? Too much had happened in Europe as a difference, but he set this first great realization, is to say that there is something that we can deduce from experience that is not just directly observable from the field, but from which we can abstract a valid norm, right, in practice, that can work for the practice in itself, right? And was Montecuccoli really new to this? In which measure can we consider coherent with what, for example, we have discussed about the loss of certain autonomous characters of modern war compared to, for example, the feudal one, right? The idea that, of course, this was becoming a war much more directed from the top, for example, so that politics was becoming more unitary in many ways, and therefore needed exactly such ever more imposing, even theoretical structures in order to cope also with military instrument, right, as von Clausewitz eventually will teach us, because this seems to have actually happened between the 16th and the 17th century, between Machiavelli and the Sun King, right? In a way, Montecuccoli was in turn also a point of arrival of certain journey that had been started from the Renaissance. And however, and we have to pay a lot of attention to this shouldn't make us forget that exactly because as an art slash science, in these times, war could be studied and was studied de facto also juxta propria principia, right? So that war was starting being realized as something that had a logic on its own. This can be seen easily. In this character we've noticed before, besides the discussions on the ethicity, you could say, the morality and the illicity of war itself, that was being surpassed in order to search for a kind of a objective and factual nature of the same war. And so I will actually like to quote a passage from Guicciardini, that was also one of the greatest thinkers of the Renaissance in this regard. He is ideally thought as just not the continuator of Machiavelli, but just, he is, darker and gloomier version, and also more insightful at certain levels in his historicistic terms. From Machiavelli, we see, the reality at the beginning of the Wars of Italy. With Guicciardini, we see it after the Wars of Italy had gone, basically, in the settled, the aspect, at least in Italian peninsula, the matters had been settled. War eventually shifted towards Flanders and took other paths, but, there was this general disappointment for which, naturally, the Spanish hegemony had taken over Italy. All these various states had kind of felt to have lost their freedom, and they were reflecting on war also, in this very bitter and realistic terms that this big and hard lesson had taught them. So I will quote Guicciardini just to point out certain aspects, especially the idea of just and unjust war, that I find very, very interesting, can help us also to understand Montecuccoli. So, trying to translate simultaneously. So, it's not a matter or administration of the world. That there is not actually a matter of administration of the world in which we need more virtues than for the commanders of armies, right? Both for the importance of case or fate, if you want, both because it is needed for the commander to think, and to put in order to an infinite and most varied set of things. Like the way is necessary, so that in this way, paraphrasing, he can both prevent from a certain useful amount of time, and also being able to immediately put the patch on it, let's say. And the neutrality in other people's war is good to those that are powerful, and that doesn't have to fear from those that will become, superior after this war, because and this can be achieved without a lot of work, right? And he can, on the contrary, in the meanwhile, hope to gain from the weakness, the disorder of others. Aside from this field, war is otherwise inconsiderate and damaging, because you can end up prey of the winner, and therefore being the defeated. And the worst of all is the war that is not done by judge but by irresolutiveness. That is, when we do not know what to do, whether to remain neutral or not. We just basically don't do anything, so we basically remain neutral, and we're just content of this. And even if we're not sucked into the war, but at least we lose an opportunity because we haven't thoroughly thought about this. And in this latter category are republics. This is because the Italians were obsessed, at least in Tuscany, with the idea of the republic, fall more easily than the princes. Right? There's great dichotomy that you find also in Machiavelli of the princes meant as the King of France, right, and the republics as Florence could be, right. And the experience has showed it, of course, but it's also kind of obvious considering what the difference is. Because he explains the republics, this is very important for the unit of command, are more divided, right? When they have to decide what to do, they don't have a unitary direction like the monarchies have. So that they will, here let's skip paraphrasing, they will always quarrel with each other, and this is what happened, he said in that episode of 1512, and this is the phrase that is striking, because he says, and he is wrong who believes that victory in these enterprises consists in war to be just or unjust. Right? Because, this is beautiful, it says, because every day we see the contrary of it. Right? That is to say, there's no thing like just or unjust. War. There's just something that functions. And he says that is not reason but prudence, the forces and the good fortune that will make enterprises won. And it is also true that in who has reason, who has, is right actually, is born a certain confidence, a certain, confidence in oneself founded on the opinion that God gives victory to the just enterprises. Right? This stuff was thought still, Guicciardini is from the 16th century, but this stuff was still thought by, think about Leopold I during the siege of Vienna, as we have seen in those videos about the siege. And that makes, that God gives victory to men because they're from a just cause, and that makes man bolder and more obstinate, right? From which sometimes actually are born sometimes victories, but not always, right? So that having the just cause can indirectly, be brought to believe it actually. To be from the just side can have a positive effect, but it is false to pretend that it directly makes it. That is to say, you can even believe you are right and you're doing this for a righteous reason, but that's not what will actually make it done, right? And it's almost useless. It can't boost your morale. It can, propaganda is useful. All this stuff is useful. It's just a tool as all the others do, right? And here it's interesting because it even goes beyond whatever God actually wants. It's not saying that God doesn't actually help the right people. It's just that humans cannot properly understand that, and that they're just tricking themselves into believing something that unitely doesn't work the way it was believed. And he also adds, he who wants to hasten, to fasten too much, to hurry up too much in wars, often lengthens them. This is also something that even von Clausewitz says. That is to say, if you can do it, but you have to pre-plan it very carefully, because otherwise, if you're just courageous, just want to go there, you will need to stop unavoidably, because it doesn't just work by courage. Guicciardini says, because not having to wait either the provisions that we need, or the necessary maturity of the enterprise, it makes difficult what it would have been otherwise easy, so that in every time that he has wanted to advance, he always loses more than 1 month. Without that, for this reason, it can't be a cause of major disorder, right? So that it can also get worse in the process. And in the wars, also, he does not want to spend money. More spends, right? Because no thing wants more and more unconsiderate, effusion of money is also what Montecuccoli was pretty concerned about, and how much provisions, as much as the enterprises are, quicker, right? So that he who tries to spare money actually lengthens the enterprises, and actually, in relative terms, causes a major expense. But no thing is more dangerous than entering in the war with without basically having pre-planned it, also temporally speaking, that has not thought what will come to cost at the end, right? And especially who hasn't thought of means how to fuel this war further. And in the wars, in many things, I have seen often left the provision for war in order for the problem of judging what it was needed to be done. I'm paraphrasing, but it says basically so that they have just waited to see how they could do one thing. It would have been too late. I mean, these are things that, I don't know, even Germany during World War I was doing the same exact thing, right? Like slaughtering pigs for allegedly thinking that this would give the Germans more potatoes to eat. And by 1918, it took like more than 2 years to establish that. Politically speaking, the war was already lost, and it even turned out that all the pigs that were slaughtered actually couldn't fertilize the land, so even less potatoes were grown, even less food there was for the German soldiers and civilians, right? This is Guicciardini, 300 years before, no, even before. So you understand what we're talking about in here. This is macroscopical military mistakes done for what? For not even realizing that you must have pre-planned this whole thing before, that you must give a dimension properly to all of these factors, that you can't go to war without pre-planning, right? And that is not to say that wars properly at the time were fought without a practical approach, even in these fields, in these matters, right? Because, of course, armies were smaller, so technically less was required, but the point is that the more the needs increased, and they increased brutally, because of course they were required for doing ever more under conditions of terrible stress and and pressure and threat. These problems were ever more punching, ever more on the fore at many levels. And then Guicciardini continues and says, saying exactly this, that actually those that were who haven't thought about this had an enormous damage. And all proceeds that commonly the motion of things is ever slower than what is usually planned too. This is also another great realization, so much that what is not done, that very often what we thought to do in 1 month actually would have done in 3 or 4, right? Ask me, when I was planning my PhD thesis, that is exactly true. Perfectly spot on. and says this is very important to state. He states specifically, it's very important to recall this, to warn, he writes, wars do not have the greater enemy than the opinion that who begins them thinking that they are already won, right? Because everything that is showing too easy and safe is actually undergoing a lot of accidents, infinite accidents, and this will disorder ever more what we even thought it would happen, right? And all this with the soul, the forces. Look at this distinction, right? Even von Clausewitz fundamentally talks about, first of all, the soul, the spirit. This is the first important thing, as if it would be this is what is said, as it wouldn't be actually if they had been ordered before, right? So these are very disenchanted sounding observations, which are teeny, but that naturally, as we have said before, were born out of the very attentive eye and attentive, substantially pessimistic eye of the politician and of the realist of politics, right? Montecuccoli's ideas, to finally get to them, have a new spirit. They seem to have limpidly recovered, together with Galileo, the science true experience, right? There is now the point of saying, it doesn't matter how things go, we still can find a common language in a way to describe this and to make it at least to make it known, right? To say it's not that we can't always make it, but at least we have to know what we're going through, and at which levels, by which dimensions, which is also what von Clausewitz fundamentally says. And he let's start quoting him from the aphorisms, because he starts saying, first of all, a bit the ingredients, like, and how at least how to carry out the war properly. And let's read Montecuccoli. So he states, war is an action of armies that offend each other basically in every way, and the end of which is the final objective of which is victory, right? This is also much more Clausewitzian sounding than it is, right? It's a bit more operational sounding, especially the end, but the idea that there are these two armies that have to offend each other in every possible way is to say, it's not that there is a prearranged condition of this, that we can't say, can distinguish the boundaries of. Like, the boundaries exist, as we'll see now, dimensionally, but still everything can happen, this. And he says, war is internal, external, offensive or defensive, maritime or terrestrial, and also relatively to people and to the way and in the end of the place in very different ways. Victory is achieved by means of he uses this Italian word which is apparecchio, which sounds like appareil, to use a French, but it's this instrument, like what you have basically managed to put together to prepare, right? So it's the military instrument in some way. It's the armed forces, if we were to quote von Clausewitz. And it says let's call it appareil, right, in French, and of the disposition and the operation. So it says in every which one of these three elements, we have advantages and disadvantages that are not, just natural or acquired qualities. They can be of time, of place, of weapons, or else, right? That can be positive or negative in order to surmount the enemy. Right, so it's a bit different from actually the armed forces, but it still has to do with the preset conditions in which they're going to operate. And he said, no, this is not the appareil yet. The appareil, yes, it's probably the armed forces, but not only, because he adds the money to that. He says the appareil is made of men, artillery, ammo, baggage, and money. Right. It sounds pretty damn 17th century like. The disposition is about the forces, the country, right? Which means here broadly, I mean the country as the territory, right, ground, and to the plan that we have, either of defending or supporting or of offending, right? So it's also in some ways Clausewitzian, because von Clausewitz also said, yeah, there is a clash between the two, and there are the allies as well. It's very conceptually, but there are these similarities, of course, because it's also a matter of logic in many ways. And the operation that is carried out with resolution, secrecy, speed, marching, arresting and or fighting, right? This is slightly different from Clausewitz, right? Because from Clausewitz, the war is carried out properly in the moment of violence itself. So technically, there is a suspension. What Montecuccoli writes, like the lodging, like the suspension here is properly not part, but it's part. Well, technically, it's part of the operation. I think it's even congruent actually with what von Clausewitz says in part, but it's part, in fact, of what is more operationally concerned, right? Here there is not a broader detachment between tactics and strategy perfectly outlined like in Clausewitzian theory, but here it's naturally correct as well for the sake of Montecuccoli. Also in his aphorism, Montecuccoli stated that, for example, it was true that the war against the Turk was a just war, right, by principle and per excellence, right, because of course the war against the Ottomans for the imperials was like the first thing from their side. In fact, the spirit of crusade, we know it pretty well, was not dead yet by the 17th century. It sucks when people think that the crusades were just a medieval thing. The crusades went on throughout all the modern age, basically. And this was the time, like, think about even throughout all from the 16th to the 18th century, Tasso, or Voltaire, or Casanova, or the Ariosto. I mean, all these figures that studied the crusade made it, actually foundation with the Free Jerusalem is one of, together with Shakespeare, Ariosto together with Shakespeare and Cervantes are basically the pillars of modern Western literature. I mean, there is no doubt whatsoever. Those are the people who made the modern age at a literary level, and they were talking about this stuff, right? Right. Think about Don Quixote, or the same. So the ideal even that was rationalized as disenchanted, romanticized, even comical way, but it was still there actually. It was still something that lived throughout, especially those wars here of Central Europe that were the first, against the Turk, from the Habsburgs to Venice, right? And we cannot fail but to recognize the glorious days of Vienna and of Jan Sobieski, right? That would have come, right? And that, thanks to Montecuccoli, could happen, because if it hadn't been for him in 1664. Jan Sobieski would have remained in Poland, because Vienna would have already been Ottoman by his time, right? And so the problem, however, is that not much I don't know how to say that, the last flicker of life of the crusade in itself that can be adverted in Montecuccoli's work, that naturally was realizing that the religious parabola was somewhat being detached also from the realpolitik of Europe. The end of the 30 Years' War actually brought to the acknowledgement that Europe would have remained split between Protestants and Catholics, for example. And now it was over. Like, there was no other way to reverse that. So equally, something else was being developed, even just in the idea of Christianity. But the point I would like to stress is that Montecuccoli doesn't properly care whether the war is just or not. Right? He's still very far from the Nietzschean aphorism that sounded, if I'm not wrong, something like, you say it is the good cause that allows even war, and I say unto you it is the good war that allows any cause, right? With that comes to an extreme, and I don't even, Clausewitzianly agree with that. if not by the broader. I mean, Nietzsche's philosophy is actually very fascinating, but it's not the time to discuss it. So that, as you understand it, a good war basically justifies everything. What is a good war, actually? What Montecuccoli actually cared about, considering also he was a faithful servant of the Holy Roman Empire and also Knight of the Golden Fleece, it's not about the cause. It's about war by itself. Have you ever thought about this? There's a beautiful passage from the Mahabharata that says something like, there's this warrior that is torn apart by, should I fight, should I not? And, the deity comes to him and says, why are you troubling yourself so much? Who are you? Like, I'm a warrior. He says, then fight. Why do you have to think about anything? Of course, that is from ancient India, where the cases and everything, warriors truly in part at least didn't have ideally to worry. But even in here, it's interesting parallelism with Montecuccoli, because war was breathed together with air in those times. It was something very normal in many ways. It was becoming ever more destructive and controversial in this sense. But this guy was a nobleman. He was a vassal of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor, fought against the Turk, who was an infidel. Was absolutely normal to fight. What's the other point? That's what the aristocracy does, right? Who cares at the end of the day? That's what we do for a living. So let's try to do it in a functional way. And this is interesting because actually from Clausewitz reasons in a very similar fashion. Right, in the Funk-Trigger, we have not found even once a reference to religion, for example. And von Clausewitz was surely Christian. And the point there is not that he's not a Christian. The point is that it's not important because war is a universal phenomenon. So people always fought war in the same ways, and we should sort out how it has always been working. And that is independent from religion or any other belief, as far as humanity is concerned, right? Which is also an enormous cry for the humanity of war. It truly is, right? And humanity is not the good, peaceful, nice thing. Humanity can be the good, peaceful, nice thing. It can be the worst thing you ever imagine. That's humanity in its dual nature, and it's always been so. And we know it, scientifically speaking. We know it's written in our genes. So let's quote Montecuccoli again, this time about the offensive war. He states, in order to attack a country with offensive war, we have to observe these axioms. 1. To be stronger than the enemy, and master of the campaign, and to have the better army. Right? Yeah, we would all like that, wouldn't we? Caesar, so you see here the classicism that reemerges, was used to say that there are essentially the things that acquire, preserve, and grow, in large states: soldiers and money. And definitely Caesar would have agreed with that, because he invaded Gaul for that sole purpose of having enough money, having enough legions to eventually take power in Rome. And Montecuccoli makes this contemporary remark. He says, France today, the France of the Sun King, buys with money many places. You remember the video we made the other day about Louis XIV, annexing with the Chambre de Réunion, right? All those various border, German cities on the right. And it's exactly the same thing he was referring to. Of course, Montecuccoli, that would inform Prince, again, in the same fashion, was dramatically, anti-French, as you can imagine. But by nature, because once again, where he was born, in Italy, as in the Holy Roman Empire, he had to fight against France because they were enemies. That's it. Right? It's that cool, believe me. And it says France buys many places, but also other, he kind of uses this beautiful term in Italian. It's farce. Basically, he kind of breaks through, like he opens forcibly with arms, and that's also exactly what the Sun King did. 2.2, surveilling the conjunctures that are basically that in the province that you have to invade. Basically, there is a interesting war or factions, let's say politically speaking, and that you may be called by one of the two sides, right? 3, to give battles, right? Putting terror in the country. This is what war most of the time is really about, putting terror in the country. That's a daily business. Remember, before, during the 30 Years' War, we said 1/3 of the German population wiped out, dead, right? This is what he meant. Also, making running the fame of being the stronger than what you actually are. Fake news, anyone, you think that we invented fake news? You're flattering yourself and your time pretty too much. Fake news exists since the dawn of politics and warfare. And to actually split the army in so many corps as much as you can with safety, with security, so that you can operate more things at the same time. Also very interesting. There is something from Clausewitz of this too. 4, treating well who surrenders, treating badly who makes resistance. 5, protecting your back, right? In many ways, that is always very important. Leaving quiet and stable the things in your home and at the borders, right? Think about the supply lines. That is vital for them. 6, fixing stably your foot, right? Establishing somewhere that as a fixed center you will have to sustain, will be valid to sustain every movement, right? Have an important logistical base to seize the rivers, the passes, mountain passes, to form well the line of communication and of the correspondences. So here properly the communication, also in terms of information, knowledge, letters, stuff like that. 7, to shoo the enemy from fortresses, assaulting them by storming them, and fighting him during a campaign. Also imagining to make great conquests in war without fighting is chimeric, right? This is very similar to the first quote we made before, and it is exactly what great part of the Clausewitzian theory is actually based on. 8, cutting the enemy supplies, taking away from him warehouses by surprise, by force, confronting him, pressing him at a close distance, putting yourself between him and the places of his communication, occupying with garrisons the places are in the surroundings, surrounding him with fortifications, destroying him by hitting on his parties, the foragers, the convoys, burning his field and ammunition, smoking him. This is very interesting, because this is something that exists since the dawn of warfare at the same time. Destroying the countryside around the towns, the mills, spreading contagious illnesses. This is biological warfare, right? This stuff was also pretty much more frequent than we imagine in all warfare. Spreading, this is very important, discontent among his people. You understand what's the point here? It covers certain aspects that actually are the same ones of the Clausewitzian Trinity. This is not just about the military thing. It's really about, making him weak also outside, not just of the battlefield, and not even of the campaign, but probably even at home or wherever he's supported by. 9, gaining, your own state by edifying fortresses, citadels, and garrisoning them. Also acquire the affection of the locals, of the inhabitants, imposing garrisons and colonies, making agreements, leagues, creating factions, infesting the enemy with continuous raids, pillaging, threats, fires, and in this way obliging him to contributions, to tributes, to subjections, and even colonizing part of his land. This is something that even Machiavelli said, actually. Protecting the neighbors that are weaker, right, and also lowering the strong, the stronger one. This is definitely Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli in The Prince writes exactly the same thing, and also not letting the great foreigners, so the great foreign powers, to put a step in there. Syria, anyone, right? Leading often the principal chiefs as, deducting them basically and deporting them as hostages, and especially the most honorable ones, and taking away from them the power, the will to make trouble, to make revolts, right? Beautiful, right? And think that this stuff was done for real. So all this insanely pressing and violent and destructive craft was done, right? Exactly the same way. This was war. This has always been war. This will always be war, right? He saw all this stuff. He did all this stuff. This is what a general does, right? Of the defensive war, he says, in defensive war, we have to observe these maxims. 1, to have one or more fortresses well placed that support the assailant, up to the point that, of course, that they support in the sense that they can't sustain the enemy when he invades, right? So they can't cope with him, they can't defend. Up to the point that your own army is gathered and the support can come from, for example, here entails the allies. So he literally says of those people that are jealous of the power of this invader, right? He is succeeding in his invasion. So we are looking from the defensive side. Always bear in mind at this point. 2, backing and inflaming inflaming with energy, the various strongholds with a flying body, that is to say, here I don't know what it says, because I don't know if he says the strongholds or it's actually the people, the squares, I don't know. But here is, he talks about strongholds, that is to say, send him some detachments there and make them support each other. Pretty sure of that. 3, against the civilian rebellions, keep the war outside of the country. This is also very important. Also Machiavelli spoke of this because, of course, it's more a political thing than anything. If the enemy invades your country, it's not because you necessarily have to raise it to the ground. He just wants to find a friendly supporting faction there, and that overthrows you because you've grown too weak, and then they deal, right? They make a deal where they, because it says, you have to keep because of the war outside of the country, because of the rebellions, because in your land there could be, some, let's say this evil and unquiet humors, as he defines it, can vent off, release their steam before the enemy, it becomes too close, so that they can do something about it against you. 4, if you are without an army, or with weak forces, or with just cavalry, this is very interesting, because Montecuccoli also fought, in the Pannonian Plain, that is to say, an area where normally cavalry had, historically had always a great importance, and all these raids and all this stuff is, as as a great value. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had revived the use of cavalry. European armies were going in that direction, so actually the Habsburgic armies were some of the places where these ethnic cavalries, especially from Central and Eastern Europe, also partly Southeastern Europe, came from. And so Montecuccoli had these people under his command more than other countries in Europe. Maybe just Poland and Russia had something, surely actually even more actually than the Habsburgs. So if you basically don't have enough sources to cope with the invasion, do this. 1, retreat everything that you can inside certain strongholds or enclosed places, destroy all the rest. Scorched earth strategy. Maximize in those places where the enemy can take place, right? This fashion, that is to say, destroy everything where the enemy is going to settle, because so he can't find anything to live off, to sustain himself off. 2, enlarge with fortifications when you discover that the enemy is trying to enclose you. Change place. That is to say, do not end up like a mouse with a cat, right? Try to also separate. Do not expose yourself in a place where you will be surrounded or reduced to the impossibility of acting, or like even attacking or even retreating, of course, and therefore keep afoot. This is very interesting. Either on land, or either on water, on sea, or over a river. This is very interesting. Thinking also Battle of the Rab River, that where he waited for the Ottomans that were indeed invading in that case. So we can think exactly of that campaign in this maxim. 3, prevent the enemy action by basically sending a reinforcement in all the close to support all the strongholds where he approaches, so that basically everywhere he arrives he finds a minimal concentration of forces that can harass him while he's trying to storm those strongholds. It can even try to demotivate him to attack it, and distribute in the close places cavalry that can infest him continuously. This is amazing. I think it is also what the Romans did during the late antiquity. You were saying all these cavalry contingents to harass the barbarians when they invaded, so that were loaded in enemy territory with the spoils, and their supply lines were stretched in cavalry, harassing them continuously. Guerrilla, right? Occupy the passes that are also pretty tough to break through, and crush bridges and mills. Right? It's not about in the 17th century, like bridges costed just a few, right? So, but just you must do it in this circumstances. Also, inflate the waters by cutting or putting a barrage on the rivers, and also this is interesting. Also, enclosing the forests. This is interesting. I don't know exactly what it means, but even in there are certain specific passages, of course, within the forest, so that he would put a barrage in there as well. Think about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, for example. So you would read this and say, if you're not used to think about the violence of war, this guy is ruthless. Maybe it's just him. The question is, what do you think actually war is about? Like, what exactly do you think you have to do? Do you remember the beginning of the Funkrieg when von Clausewitz says, if you think that making war less intensively is a humanistic principle, you clearly are an anti-humanistic person, because you will make actually more people dying than if you actually delivered force all in one shot, so that the thing could be settled immediately without lengthening the duration of this extremely brutal thing by definition. Right, and Montecuccoli was definitely not the only person that in those times expressed himself with these very crude terms on what to do by prescription in war. But what emerges from this is this great vigor, this great lucidity, this guy clearly so true what war really was, with a rigidity that, actually a rigor, we could say more than a rigidity, that are even, resembling a bit the provocative European Baroque of the same times, and procuring also in the observations of reality and its internal heat. Because you see here that he was a passion man, right? He truly believed there's not things that were written coldly, like the coldly, let's say in the sense that were filtered by a rational mind, but this guy was motivated by the same reasons that had made him risk life countless times on the 30 Years' War battlefields, killing, being wounded all the astonishing things that Montecuccoli went through. Read Montecuccoli's biography and just summarized. It's something astonishing what this man went through, right? It's a perfect representative of the so many veterans of the 30 Years' War. One of those who made it, right? Not that ended up in misery, right? Without a job, ostracized by civilization, but even with some maybe traumatic stress and so on, because that was a pretty sad business as well. And there is so much, like, we could pair, like, I don't know, these aphorisms were written by the 70s of the 17th century. Just to give you, I don't know, a temporal parameter, Johann Sebastian Bach would be born in 1685, right? And it sounds a bit like Bach's music. This beautiful passage, for example, on the battle that Montecuccoli wrote. He said, "The battles give and take away kingdoms." This is a power punching line. Pronouncing the decisive and unappealable sentences among the polities, they put an end to a war, and they immortalize the commander. The wars are either, the battles are either searched, or you try to get out. They're simply given, right? And it is convenient to to mix in this such a great deal. Properly here it says such a great business, negozio, he says in Italian. This is what von Clausewitz said in the same way, that war was, if anything, a beautiful description. Is more like a trade transaction, a trade deal negotiation in the way it's led. Remember, this is the connections between the various orders. It's necessary to miss this business, the war, to warlike strength, a lot of prudence, right? Nor to sacrifice, with your eyes closed, at the army without, use or need, and not to hurry, right? As the great General Galasso, it was another Italian commander, the service of the Augsburgs during the 30 Years' War, a great artillerist. He fought in Lutzen. He had, these kind of interesting figures here that stated that those people that basically make at expense of someone else's blood fame, right, are impertinently ambitious, right? And having fresh soldiers that are fed and bold, right? This is what truly matters. And fighting with your own mind, not if others take you down, so that they make you fight at their own will, right? You have always to be in control of the situation, not throwing your men away, making sure they're functional, they're fresh, they're well fed, they're spirited, and always try to get the upper hand. Do not fight at the enemy's condition. Also, try to camp to battle when you actually hope to win for real, right? And there are good chances for it. Or when you have to leave a fortress from a siege, or when you fear essentially that you will be ruined if you didn't fight, right? Not having, being pushed to fight because you have been reproached or flattered by adulations or exhorted by someone as well. So thinking even about all the expectations that these generals had, the competition, right, and all they were hotheads, right? There was still this chivalric ideal. They fought from the front. Think about Gustavus Adolphus, the time he risked, and as he ended, actually. That very reason. These were knights, as we've seen. They knew also how to fight as common pikemen, as generals, right? So they knew the thing from right. But this is normal. Generals do risk their lives together with all their other troops, and also attack if you have to prevent the reinforce that will come to the enemy, or the arrival of the reinforcement to the enemy, or taking this conjuncture of some advantage, as for example, there's an army passing by, or the enemy army gets divided, or he also makes some other mistakes. And these are all the ways to actually also bring an enemy to battle. And he makes this list. It says, besieging a stronghold of some importance. That was objectively still at this point one of the most important thing, like what most warfare was actually about, strategically speaking. Devastating his counter, right? Taking him by surprise or in some dire strait, or disunited in the march, or forgetful in the quarters, or blocked between two armies, for example, or leading him to a trap with a feint to retreat, to march somewhere else, and with another ready counter march, instead obliging him to give battle. Right? Also, there is to be considered that the balance of the forces on the field is also very Clausewitzian, in the sense it says, just think of what it can't be before, but in function of what will always be afterwards, right? Being inferior to the enemy forces, or waiting for help, or finding yourself in advantageous places, or getting, for example, all things that can happen that can advantage or disadvantage you. There is, for example, a split command, right? Most of the armies during 30 Years' War didn't have kind of a truly unified command, or at least there was still a lot of this, disorder in the unity of command that reflected the absence of a proper state also in practice. Also, Montecuccoli says, in coming to battle, consider also properly these temporal parts, and this is also very Clausewitzian, as we were considering this. The first, the action and the aftermath, right? The beginning, the action, or the before, properly, the act and the aftermath. The before, he says, invoking God, Lord of our armies, right? This is Old Testament, right? Lord God of battles, the Bible. So gathering together all the possible forces, examining this is like from Clausewitz easily, this concept of the mass of support of the decisive battle in many ways, to examine the advantages of the side, the wind, the sun, right, and choosing the field corresponding to the number and the quality of the army, to prevent the enemy, to animate, to boost the morale of soldiers, that they have to, properly be, confident enough to go there, to do the thing. The attitude, even the clothing and the speaking of the commander, right? If you'd say this is kind of weird, well, by the 17th century not, because there was an enormous emphasis, as we was realizing before, about the individuality of the commander. He had to be really a character that had to inspire the troops. So even knowing how to dress well in this, kind of aristocratic chivalry knightly fashion, right? And knowing how to speak well, the oratory skill before the battle, this is very important as well. You have to propose the victory to the soldiers, right? The duty, the necessity, the glory, the booty, and the rewards, and the end of all these fatigues, right? So then you have to reinforce for certain the spirits. They have to give them to drink something. Here talking about alcoholic beverages, it says mediocrely, so just in the right quantity. This was a very important battle as well. To let's say, also here it says to pretend to have made this beautiful ominous dream about the future victory, right? This stuff was believed in the ancient world to be, a religious gift, premonition, right? Here it says simply, tell them that you have had the dream. And then it doesn't matter if it is that's the modern age, right? That's where the much secularism has kicked in. and also them reveal to the troops also something similar to this. Give them ammo, the word battle, as so that they could recognize each other on the field. These battlefields were a total mess. They couldn't understand anything, what the hell was going on. And also that they, of course, you have to arrange them. Here, paraphrasing, because it's very long. It says, to arrange it, of course, that they can use their arms at their advantage, right? In a specific tactical function. Consider all the varieties of arms. This is also very interesting about the combination of course, infantry, cavalry, artillery, to put them together in a fashion. Here, pike and shot warfare had not been surpassed yet. It was about to be, and it says also, because it says you have to take into consideration all of the various arms, so that you have to use them at need without breaking or dismembering the various squadrons, right? Because he says the place of the combat will change, right? The order of the enemy will change also during the battle. So, here we can't digress, but there is all the problem how to surpass. Basically all the pike and shot era was spent debating how to fix pike and shot, right? And it took hundreds of years. Naturally, also other armies were endlessly debated on how they would evolve and not, but there was always this problem: how do we actually make exactly the pike and the shot interact functionally, right? And together, the shot meant even the musketry, the artillery, the pike, of course, the infantry, but also there is the cavalry element with the sword, other fire. It's complex, of course. And so you have to the armies were still very, let's say, cumbersome, not particularly agile. They were, bulky, slow things on the field. So the way you prearrange them was crucial in this regard, as he says. That is to say, you have to contemplate all the various possibilities, so that, you have deployed the army in that way, but consider it, and you can't move it pretty much during the battle, but consider what can happen in the sense so that you don't have to unhinge the wall formation in order to make a unit intervene when you need it, right? Hopefully, right? Of course, these things could not be predicted completely. And he says, to makes, of course, infantry, cavalry, and artillery in a way that they can help each other mutually, also so that the enemy cannot invest cavalry without being essentially shot by musketry fire. Also, do not employ infantry without having the support of cavalry. Right here, times are changing. Cavalries are coming back on the battlefields prevalently. And in ancient times, he said every regiment, infantry regiment, contained a certain number of cavalry and artillery. And of the cavalry, there were, here he's talking about properly Renaissance armies. The cuirasses, full body armor, some other half armored, half body armor, others lighter and without armor. So this will, that they will have still to be incorporated, if I understand what it says here, in the present day. And because they indispensably need the support of one another. This is what it says. Right, and it says it was true at the time. It says actually now in modern commune ordinances, in which let's say, here it says something very interesting. Here it says the times have changed, because it says now the space, also the battlefields have enlarged, and the units are very distant, right? Because also the fire has increased. This says now the cavalry basically cannot support very much each other anymore with this segmentation. They're very spaced, thousands of paces of distance. So here it says, what's the favor they can receive infantry from cavalry and this from that. Basically says, that now that there's not much anymore this interdependency between the two things. That cavalry is becoming ever more cavalry. Once again, it's recovering from the Caracol times, ideally much more this shock power, right, regaining it, so that it has to be employed with that function. So, and even if you have to make infantry and cavalry support each other, still they are, differentiating even more for their specific function. And also says, of course, that the cavalry wings must always cover the flanks of infantry. And it says that it can happen that infantry can remain lost and defeated because of the strength of the cannons, as the Swedish battalions were destroyed at Battle of Nordlingen in 1634. And after the cavalry was thrown out of the field, the Swedes realized that because of this fault, they had to repair by posing musketeers platoons and some little piece of artillery between the squadrons of horses. But it wasn't enough, so that broken these squadrons, the platoons, were necessarily butchered, as it in fact happened to them, so that they didn't have any other close body to recover to, nor pikes that could sustain them. And how could they, be supported by an infantry who was so far away in that sense? And he says, but given the aforementioned ordinance, it's evident that no side can be invested unless that the assailant has first of all shot with his artillery, and eventually with musketry, and eventually with the pistols, right? Because the caracole, by the way, still existed in practice, but it had diminished, and finally he has to sustain the shock, the assault of the pikes and of the cavalry together, an advantage that cannot be obtained in the distant division of these types of arms, right? So here, actually it would require me to wrap my mind a bit better around it, but here the point I think he's making is that, of course, there is still need of support in spite of the various armies, as always, despite the battlefield is changing with ever larger distances. So whatever, this is, well, maybe you will explain me that, because now I'm just passing by. I didn't prepare this before, honestly. If not, I have read the topic, and I don't know what he's referring to specifically, right? But there's still a time in which they were thinking of what to do specifically with these pike and shot tactics, yet evolving towards transforming to a more fluid system. Also, he says to dispose in such a way that you can fight multiple times, so that you can maintain, this is very important, the reserves, as also von Clausewitz is very concerned by, to maintain entire units till the very end as pieces of the game in chess. Also, deploy the army on 3 lines, the first one of which being the stronger, as the one that has in fact to sustain the strongest of the enemy assault, the second slightly less, and the third composed only by some reserve, right? Or in 2 lines, each of which can have its own reserve. So this is also interesting because more than 3 lines, also in many other armies, it starts becoming something too complicated to manage, in the sense you don't essentially know how also they're all going to hold all together, support each other. It's a compromise between mass cohesion and this also flexibility thanks to the reserves. Then it states ensure on the battle flanks, let's say, with some forest, hill, bank, river bank, some say fall, some broken terrain, village, right, so that it can become a bastion that can flank and give properly a dimension to the battlefront, so that more or less also what the enemy choices are for that matter. And this also can be carried out with trenches, wagons, chains, ropes, palisades, triboli, right? against the cavalry too. Certain, florid trees, or with some battalions, of course. And you have also to provide that the troops can all support one another without much confusion. That's very important as well. That the routes can, do not cause this domino effect to press against the other. And for this reason, putting the reserves behind two infantry in the midst and also in the corners, or behind a hill or a forest or wood, let's say better, and in front of the intervals to actually come to help the first, to run on the enemy, and to come back into in line without actually going against some other units and disordering them. So that also light cavalry, and it's interesting that this is used, is to be placed in a location where when he is gonna be attacked, he, by giving way, he doesn't create confusion, right? So it doesn't create also terror in the others, because also light cavalry is often on the run by definition, and therefore the intervals have to be proportioned to the squadrons and the battalions that you've placed to help to support. Also, they don't have to be particularly large, nor so frequent that the enemy can come against it with a broad front and to make up this strong pressure, and therefore to oblige the reserves to immediately enter to fill the gap. This is also very interesting, right? Because it's kind of a dispersed line. It's kind of it's what more like a defensivistic attitude in some way. Still to mostly to resist the pressure and of course possibly also inflicting to the enemy, but realizing that the enemy strength can be dispersed by having this narrower front against which it's not convenient for an enemy to charge necessarily, where he's going to, like spearheads, is going to find more problematic to break through, and is going to find a reserve behind, and having committed too many troops, right? And this would basically produce the battle to have just only one front, otherwise. And this could still happen in theory, right? At least in the broader mass of the formation. And it's calculated, he says, that a soldier, an infantryman, when he is well restricted to fight, he actually occupies as much as inside as much as 1.5 in depth. And while a cavalryman, 2 units from the front and 3 in the back. Of course, cavalry occupies more depth compared to the infantryman, but also infantry is not like a square, like it's more like a rectangle, and this also means you can't make a unit switch, for example, side of the formation during the battle, if not making a more complex maneuver that entails the maneuvering of the whole army, the weaving of it, not just changing front during the battle. It says both the distance between the first and the second line have to be 150 and 200 steps circa, and between this and the third one 300, right? And this also so it's not dramatically short as a distance, by the way. So compared to other times, there is a strong support after all between the various arms. This has to do naturally with firepower that had these ranges, all useful ranges at these times. And here also, where the battle is ordered in 2 lines, only with their own reserves to find themselves ready to face against different sides, given that, of course, even the squares were built with different fronts by definition, but certain other units weren't. So at this point it says deploy the front in a convenient way, so that you're not going to be surrounded by the enemy, and in order to actually try to outflank him, basically, if he is too restricted at the same time. So of course, the narrower the front is, the less convenient it is to engage him on the front, but you can still outflank him in some ways. And for the same reason, you don't have, however, to thin your line in depth so that you will lack the support of the reserves, right? You can extend this, but you have to take into account in the maneuver that you still need, if you widen the front to surround the enemy, that you need the reserves to follow you, at least. And this is kind of complicated at that point. And this would be also to bet all the battle on one front in some way. Place cavalry all on one wing only when the other one is protected by when the terrain, let's say, is protected by the same side, right? So if you have a protected flank, you can't place cavalry from the other side, in greater number. Also, distribute the general people on the isle. It says to distribute basically troops all around the corps of battle, on all the fronts of the army, even in the rear, right? And it says having troops also commanded on the flank, so that every squadron and platoon of musketeers that must have a close refuge, because the musketeers were outside of the pike formation. So when they were charged at some point, they were vulnerable, of course, to cavalry, and they had to have close support. Or perhaps if they were dragoons, that technically at this point were still infantry, mounted infantry that is mounted to fight, and that can mount if if cavalry breaks, they can also mount as a response or to get away. I don't know here what it means specifically, but I'm just because I'm poorly translating. So here it says placing troops that have to kill actually the enemy captain. Right. This is particularly important, or that here uses a term that sounds strange, transfuggitori. That means people that run through, right? It seems sort of like the concealed troops during flank attacks, because it says they have the objective of attacking the enemy from the rear, right? So this was also employed. This is often overlooked. Also, everybody concerned about the front, the line of fire, the strength of pikes, but still flank attack is something happens always in warfare. You should always be seeking to carry out, and that's what they did as well. Take away from the soldiers line of escape, so that they have either to win or die, right? This was also done frequently, deploying in front of a river or some an obstacle that would discourage the fleet. It's not that this would prevent it, but at least it would maybe take more time to make people break, because they realize how difficult it would be even to escape. Also keep in the rear of the battalions religious, the barbers, the riders that have to assist, right, and cure and also register the various casualties and so on. Also compose the squadrons of 150 to 200 horsemen on 3 lines, right, of the unit, and the battalions 500, 1,000, and 1,500 for the infantry, in 6 lines, right, and place large artillery between infantry in the midst of the wing of the sides. This was done often, that the battle line had this infantry in front, and in the midst of the various unit, between the gap of unit and other artillery, and the smaller one interspersed instead among the cavalry in the same way almost all in the first front, because artillery was usually, in fact, deployed like this, and even over the here I think, I don't know, it says close to the generals that are in the rear, right? So there was artillery in the rear too, close to where the generals were, so that they shoot over the arm, right? The cannonballs are shot crossing over the armies, would evolve eventually to in 18th century warfare. And so the artillery must be disposed in a way that he does not hamper the march, and the musketry fire, of course. And where the field is made of stone, you should make shorter shots, right, to shoot more shortly, so that the ball of the hitting in the stones makes them, jump over the enemy arm. This is interesting as well. And so to create a sort not just of just the shells, the splints and all this stuff, but also probably here a ricochet fire to causing further debris to fly away. So the squadrons of support must, of reserves must support and sustain, and you have to place kind of heavier troops quickest once placed in an advantageous side. So here's the concept of reserving depth with the best troops in the rear, specifically. Also, draw the form of the battle and give it to every officer for the part that concerns him, right? This is so they have to know the battle plan, right? The wagons with ammo have to be placed behind some barrier, either a hill, right, in a safe place that is covered, and subdivided in multiple places, so that if a part blows up, the rest doesn't too. And the wagons have to be covered with ox skin and kept close to the infantry too. And this ammo has to be on certain coaches and 2 wheels that are to be actually turned in the center. So basically, you can even turn them, and they can become. They can be turned and actually keep. Yeah, the powder. This is interesting. The ammo actually in certain holes in the ground. This is interesting as well. And enclosing the baggage around within an enclosure of wagons with guards at the back of the army, right? We're talking about the Hussite tactics some days before. This stuff was done usually, actually, even before, and still in this time. And at the distance of musket, right? So that they can theoretically also support each other, not completely detached from the formation, replacing it instead also over some hill, or detached from the battle, and having made with the sappers a ditch around it and having placed some guards there. Or otherwise you can leave it in near strongholds, so that your own troops actually will not take the chance to sack it and to sack the camp, their own camp, and go away with that. So this is also fascinating. It tells you about the discipline, also 17th century armies. Then it says, in the act of battle, beating the enemy on time and charging him before he is in order. This is very interesting, of course. It's all about attacking the enemy before he has been able to deploy, and make prisoners immediately, so that they will examine separately with threats or torture in order to have safe information on the state of the enemy and the circumstances, to occupy the most comfortable places like high grounds, argents, like passages, in order to prevent the, 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 the the arrival of the enemy, or to ensure for yourself the protection of the flanks and your back. Also, make artillery shoot as soon as the enemy is in range, and plant over a high ground the pieces in different lines, one after the other, and do not stop under the enemy fire, right? And on the contrary, attack it as long as it begins to fire, right? Do not stop to fire your own artillery if you're under attack. On the contrary, you have always to keep it busy in that sense. And this is important also because artillery technically was like it's not, artillery wasn't designed to actually shoot against other artillery. Mostly was, of course, against mostly infantry and even cavalry, but still the idea that if the enemy keeps you under fire, you should respond as much as you can. It says, then commence the battle from that side in which your best troops are placed, and where you feel to be stronger, of course, and keep with the weaker one instead the enemy at bay, and belating basically the the fight, or being helped by the side, by the place. And here naturally there are lots of aspects that you say they are even contradictory, in the sense that of course your best troops may be placed on a terrific ground, and that may do on the battlefield depending on what's the specific situation. But it's obvious that you have to contain the enemy in a way. You have to also terrain plays a very important part to play them. And if you have a weak unit that you can deploy on a better terrain, like to compensate for its weakness, right? That also does. It's just it depends on relative terms. Then says fighting violently and being on the offensive. This is also very interesting, and it's partly connected to Clausewitz in concept, right? If the terrain is even, especially, and forgive heart to your man, but otherwise wait steadily with firm foot if the enemy is on an advantageous ground, and if, I don't know, if you're shooting at the position of the enemy shooting, I don't know exactly. Yeah, possibly both things actually, so that you also have to stay where you are, even if you're under fire for a while, and keep so that you're not lured to attack the enemy in a strong position that he wants you to. But even in there, it's relative. It may not be convenient at some point. Well, depends. But then maintain justly the preordered distances, and not so short that they can prevent the movements, not so large that will give easy access to the enemy, and that remain undetached from the reserves. Then seconding the time, refresh the worn out troops, right? Exchange, make reserves intervene at the right moment in that regard. Do not make caracals, it says, nor commit ever the reserves, if not by necessity. Like, the reserves must be there, they're crucial, fundamental, and always leave some support where the broken troops can gather, can reunite, but without leaving without, however, helping also those that need support and that are fighting on the battle line, so that, of course, there is a point where you have troops retreat, but it's not because they are supposed to retreat. On the contrary, you should hold the line. Otherwise, you would have not fought that battle in that way. And make sudden sorties to press the enemy, or to, especially when he is wavering or has some other effect in this sense, and sustain the troops that are, wavering from your side themselves, reunite them, regroup them, and lead them to charge once again. But do not hurry with the ones that are they're exhausted or disconcerted, but let them give the time to regain breath and heart. This is very important as well, but also, this usually happens in a dramatic situation. You can't spend more than much and think you can't get it back in a fight. Also, shoot continuously. This is interesting. Not all together, but in sequence and by interval, right? So that there's a kind of not properly platoon fire, but it's still a way. There's a continuous fire, so that the first ones had reloaded when the last had finished. So continuous fire, and there is always fire in the air, as it writes, and shoot particularly at the officers, aim specifically at the officers, right? Snipering here was already a thing, importantly. Do not, and the officers, of course, this gives a great compliment to the officers, were fundamental to, in their experience, to maintain the troops in order during these dreadful situations. Do not go too far from the main body of the army in order to pursue the enemy. Do not naturally lose cohesion in this sense. Do not pillage and do not loot the enemy camp until the enemy is not is completely out of the field, right? And also invest the side of the enemy squadrons with troops commanded, with chosen troops, that are, troops that are specifically, they have to be very able to do that, to perform that maneuver, and have specific, dispositions and valor for it, so that they have to enter in their own intervals and run after them while they're broken, and also to take out those that are still, standing their ground. This is also somewhat ideal, but it is naturally important. I mean, if you have the chance of doing it. And also, it says, do not use ever something that fundamentally that does not have its own specific function. This is as it could be translated. Do not, spend too many energies for a weak, let's say for an area where the enemy is weak, in the sense that not that it's weak spot, but that his troops are not up to the level of your force, right? Do not spend your elite for chasing troops that are worthless, right? And while his own strong side instead is fresh, that's actually pretty it's a mistake. Also, do not spend this resources when the enemy is already tired, right? Preserve this. This is very important idea of maintaining reserves, broadly speaking. Also, do not begin the battle at night or towards the evening if you have to fight with few against many, or if you have to attack a camp, because the night gives rise to feints and to traps. And also here it's different to paraphrase, but it says something like night can cause tricks for which even if you fight well, there is not the same motivation in many ways. Like it's too different. We can't see, so it's not. You can do it, but it's not advisable. Let's say. Also, make a few prisoners. So, do not make few prisoners. Here said, I don't exactly know what it means. The following, however, place them aside during the battle. Also, because this is technical throughout the battle, it says before the cover with the troops before the battle. Cover with the troops a swamp or a ditch, and when the enemy advances, fake the retreat for certain passages that are specifically made on it, so that he can count in the trap, and where he can be bogged down essentially with attracting even with fake fire. This is also interesting, and other tricks. I don't know what it says, but with similar stratagems. Also, inform continuously, or better, get information as a general continuously from everywhere, right? So that you can know essentially when you can detach the troops wherever the thing is happening to balance the situation. The good and evil here says, and where a part of the army is breaking, the other part is prevailing. And here it says also, because naturally it could happen that in some place you're winning, in some place you're losing, but if the good is better, pursue that advantage, right? If instead if the evil, the thing is going bad, instead spend time to support those who are breaking. Says also, pursue the enemy, the defeated enemy, the broken enemy with light cavalry, and come and other people that are specifically designed for doing it, because of course light cavalry, that's what you want to spend during battle. You need instead heavier stuff most of the case. You can't waste otherwise. And do not give the enemy time to reunite, right? And on the contrary, losing when you are losing instead and you have lost the hope of victory. And this is interesting because we're seeing von Clausewitz the case in which you have to realize when it's over. It may also come at a point of the battle where the rout has still not happened. A retreat in the best way possible. This is also what von Clausewitz says, right? And there is much of this. Then there is after the battle. This is shorter. Says either you win or you lose. It's fascinating how he simply says, there's no halfway in practice. And in the victory, thank God. Render praise to God. Bury the dead. Publish victory. Exaggerate it. This is something that von Clausewitz says as well about the moral effects of victory. You can inflate fundamentally after a battle, even if it's, the military speaking, not really the thing happened. So continue the battle. Continue to press the relics of the beaten army. This is also what von Clausewitz says. Do not have time to gather again. Spread terror in the enemy, in the country with fire, with iron, pillaging, use threat, force, luring, make people rebel, gain allies and corrupt the friends and of the enemy. And while after the battle, the avid spirits are still wavering of novelty, because there is the enemy prince here is being defeated, and the magistrates also here the politics I think is being distrusted, right? This motivates why you should do it. Here brings some examples, of the Carthaginians abandoned by the Numidians, another example by Egypt when they were defeated fundamentally. Also storm strongholds, right? Place your foot steadily. So of course exploit this gap that is formed, strategically speaking. This line seems to simply to read von Clausewitz. Conceptually speaking, it's exactly the same thing. And divide the army in different parts at some point. Do not pillage the provinces that where you have actually, in fact, intention to maintain your own troops, right? To seize the property of course, or to garrison to build your troops. Also, in the defeat, conversely, do not lose spirit, because the arms are daily, here it says, meaning that, it's the fortune of arms. One day you win and one day you lose. It says, retreat the relics of the army and reunite the ones that are broken. Arm the people of the country. That is to say, create a sort of territorial militia to at least defend what is left. The army cannot defend anymore. And make new levies in this sense. recruit new troops and throw them inside the strongholds, right? The passes, the frontiers, the other strongholds in general, block the forests, break the bridges, right? Flood the country, right? Use auxiliary troops, allies, but in a way that they do not prevail, because of course they can exploit the situation as well. Because Montecuccoli doesn't have a great opinion, says they're not, the allied troops are not so different after all from the enemy ones, because they're infidel, inconstant, disobedient, so on, and they, also in the counter, they exact a heavy toll. It says, for the retreat, gather the people in the camp or in the closer places where you can, so that this can maybe serve to resist to an enemy corps that is pursuing, and also gather in the stronghold that is kind of more exposed, where you think that it's more exposed to peril, and destroy your baggage also. Pick just the best part of it and send troops further ahead to actually instruct the various troops where to march, where to go quickly, because here's a matter of time. The enemy has just won. It's a critical situation. Also, when you pass a strait, provide it, defend it, barrage it, close it in this sense. If it's a wood, cut it, as we were saying before. Also, sacrifice in the rear guard a part of the troops to save the rest. This always happens actually in written battles. It's an unfortunate thing, let's say, for those who exist, usually to the death, but it always happens. And detach yourself in 4 or 5 bodies so that they can take different roads where to retreat, so that you can at least hope that the enemy doesn't take you all in one block, so that he has to disperse his own troops as well to pursue you. And also charge directly the enemy parties that have, in fact, detached from the major body, cut them off, set ambushes to them, and march speedily in column with a small rearguard group to contain the enemy, to dispose the troops for battle, and only if you're obliged to, in this sense. So we came to an end, perhaps today, of these quotes. That as you understand, we don't comment them further, because I think they're self-explanatory in many ways. I'm sorry, in the mid I lost kind of in a part, especially in the disposition of the troops on the various arms interaction, but that's somewhat clear enough. It was it's a detail, but it's still important, and maybe you should go a bit deeper into it. But it's really about the way he pictures the thing that actually matters here, theoretically speaking. And I must warn you that there are, I can say many people now, in general, most people do not actually understand much about warfare in the average. Of course, that's a dramatically underrated topic, and it's kind of embarrassing how few we actually care about it. But there are certain ideas that survive from certain historiographical trends that survived from the 19th century into the 20th, and that certain people still quote, even from fairly good military historians, telling the truth, that judged Montecuccoli in ways that are a bit too functionalistic to the idea of the evolution proper of a military art, that allegedly this would have been still imperfect compared to Napoleonic times. That there is this great idea still that this great anachronism in many ways, that even World War I is being criticized because it wasn't like Napoleonic warfare or other wars like the American Civil War. The Europeans didn't study it enough because they thought it was made by amateurs, and they were studying, by the way, other tactical problems on their own in Europe. But there is this idea that if it is not about the great decisive battle, the campaigns, this type of warfare is not, it's not interesting, right? And that there's this determinism that looks at warfare, the art of warfare, and saying, this thing has still hadn't evolved towards that, it was not still complete. We know how wrong this way of thinking it is, right? There is not an arrival point. There is just a contextual reality that changes, and it changes towards the direction just because it incidentally has done it, right? Or maybe it's even improved in a certain sense, but most of the time it cannot be properly calculated. So the point I'm making in this regard is that never think that Montecuccoli in this regard is just like a halfway between, as we were saying before, Machiavelli and von Clausewitz, right? This idea of progress doesn't fit our understanding of military history now, and we have to refuse this a priori judgment, so to discredit what is not the modernity in this regard. And we have, on the contrary, to admire the fact that if it hadn't been for these people that act like Montecuccoli, that actively gave this dramatic boost to the development of military theory, right? This clear and vigorous research for general principles that support the practice of war and make it also rationally comprehensible. This is another very important step. This is a rationalistic attitude taking form, right? Quite clearly as a method, as a theory. So it's a problem of communication as well, right? And there is also another point, maybe we can skip this, I mean, the concept of attrition, in the sense that, of course, from medieval warfare, as we've seen from ancient warfare, the warfare was mostly about attrition. So, contrarily to the Napoleonic warfare was the great battle, the great strategic thing. Of course, this was different. Of course, it was still, as we've seen, a kind of a slow, cumbersome thing on the battlefield that was moving in order to fight. But once again, it was the product of that time, and the logic that was beneath it was exactly functional for that reality. So it's not that this was a weaker way of making war. It was the best way of making war, right? As most warfare is, basically, throughout all history of warfare. And this is particularly important because, as we've seen, Montecuccoli would give a tremendous boost also to, will give rise properly to different, to a school in its own, let's say. Not properly schooled in the sense he taught, but, he was read by people who would make, for example, 18th century warfare growing, attaching even towards what the Revolutionary War and the Napoleonic era would fundamentally become, is where von Clausewitz spots probably the moment in which, for example, the problem of the fortress had become relative, right? Whereas in Montecuccoli's times it was fundamental, it was still very important, everything gravitated in many ways around that. So this is fascinating because it's you find the active element, right? The positive action, the properly the active improvement of this theory from this individual, from his military experience, that breaks the mind to reason and to act on the field in a different fashion, right? And there is even here another dimension that is Montecuccoli has also been interpreted from naturally the people that lived at these times and in the and after, and naturally there are elements of Montecuccoli that are not innovative, like that are more traditional, right? For example, the concept of attrition. These students realized that, for example, the French general Turpin de Crusade was one of the greatest supporters of the idea of the temporizing in warfare, and he saw in Montecuccoli this, and accepted and exalted this aspect, because in those times there were those people who still believed in that, right? It wasn't much about movement, right? About the lightning campaign. It was about, wearing out the enemy, here you realize the battle Montecuccoli has described in the part we have read is fundamentally an attritional battle, typically typical of the 17th century still, right? These are always experiences matured during the 30 Years' War. Warfare worked still in a specific way, so things changed eventually, right? And it's not a surprise in this regard that the 17th century authors that studied him perhaps caught more and giving an impression even to us later that he was, let's say, most of the prudential aspects of Montecuccoli's theory, right? We can see instead, with a balanced view, that in Montecuccoli we have an infinity of elements, right? There are certain nostalgias, for example, the one for the pikes, that as we have seen were the thing where he himself had started, right? There are certain contradictions that we pointed out during the read, and the point there is, if you have an idea of the history of thought, how these works were fundamentally about what the rest of literature also was fundamentally about, the development of Western ideas. Of course, lacked certain consequential elements, right? There is rather the punctualization of the experience in the fealty, right? That is nor superficial nor easy of the experimented datum, right? He's speaking like a theorist, but he's also a witness and a researcher. He's doing this, I can't stress it, in a Galilean fashion. Montecuccoli believed in the experience, and we can even think that, after all, there is even a pinch of poetry in what he's talking about. There is the marvel, there is, the reader must be, astonished, impressed, surprised, right? There is, as in all of these works, is actually what happened on the battlefields and what not. For example, those numbers we have read, that preset arrangement, everything varies wildly, battle after battle. And this, as we have seen, was an age of experimentalism in many ways already by itself. So it's obvious that Montecuccoli was also expressing his own opinion about things that others would have said, maybe it's not really like that, or maybe that he actually knew that it wasn't like the truth, right? Don't think I think every person, we have seen it in the videos we make about 30 Years' War, and it's not that we actually know how they fought in those times. Like, there are all these treatises, all these, new ideas, all these reforms, but we don't have a clear idea of how all these various formation, think about the Swedish Brigade, or even the Dutch reforms of Maurice of Nassau before. We have these ideas, we have these voices of people who say, that guy first thought that, or at least, which is also usually not true, or adapted it. There are voices, there are fashions, there are echoes, but how these guys actually fought, never think that we really know it. We do not know exactly how they did. There's a general idea we can construct, but it's never like of course not the truth, but sometimes we don't even know how banally certain mechanisms or how the troops were actually arranged, or through the practice of warfare, how the things still work. And especially in this time where there was a lot of experimentalism that probably was even less than the one that would exist in the 16th, or that had existed in the 16th, or it would in the 18th. Right, the 17th century was an era of great transition, of great, development in this sense, that passed chiefly through the practice. So Montecuccoli in this regard doesn't have to be read like a manual where you see what you would have had to do cent for cent at all times, right? Or how it actually happened in those times for real. But rather, what this person conceived the art of war should technically be, in terms of the conceptualization of it and the necessity to abstract certain principles that could be valid in the world. And this is a great achievement in the history of philosophy. Like, it's not something you, and it's also very technical. We have spotted actually certain elements that are echoed in von Clausewitz, certain concepts, certain ideas that fundamentally would remain there in that fashion. So this is even more precious because nobody had ever attempted that. You think that, the history of thought is, now we are kind of more intelligent than these people. Today we have just a way to absorb the pre-existing structures that we have, arranged exactly to assimilate. Also, thanks to these people who were trying for the first time to do something to rationalize the concept of it, right? But do not think that, for example, what happened on the battlefield was not rationalized. Because what happened in the battlefield actually was. That's one of the few things we know, that it was functional for real to what had to happen. It's just that most of the time we don't know how it really happened, right? It's like, I don't know, the fact that in Roman times there's not a big deal, that there's not a big deal of manuals that tell us what to think about, because most of the NCOs of these people that had to carry out the simplest thing we were interested in didn't write, and nobody wrote at that point, historically speaking, with the interest of telling the thing that just those people that were from inferior classes actually did, and that more or less who was invested in business war knew, or at least didn't see them as a big deal. The same in many ways happens here. Here there is a very different mindset. There is an interest also towards the details in the mechanistic aspect of the story, but what you read doesn't have to be judged in the sense this guy was saying something wrong because we know, or now we think better. It's not like that, because you would have not defeated the Ottomans on the Arab in 1664 if you had been there. Montecuccoli did. And he did because he had a freaking military experience on his shoulders. Right? And people up to that time were not taught to reason in that systematic, rationalizing fashion. That's something that happened very recently, historically speaking, up to 100 years ago in the West, just like a 10 or 5% of the people were capable of thinking in theoretical terms. Now it's the majority. But the practical term at the time was overwhelmingly superior. People said, reasoning things in terms like, if something doesn't work, why would you think about it in theoretical terms? I mean, seriously. Now, everything is able to reason like that, but is also dramatically inept in practical terms. So when you think about these times, and meat grinders like the 30 Years' War, never think that that was dysfunctional for those times being, and that these writings were expected to be like a print of the reality of the situation. It was an intellectual effort that we have to appreciate as such, and to understand in its deeper roots, also from a philosophical point of view, from a literary point of view, and naturally to make a history of the thing and realizing certain aspects that unfortunately fully we will never know. Right? There is still a lot to discover, but at the same time, there is a limitation to it that it's pretty there, and pretty much there, and you can't really erase, right? Alright, so this was definitely a long video, but I think it was worth it, because we introduced this figure for the first time with a dedicated video. We will keep looking at these thinkers, and we will hopefully expand on the whole era from a military point of view. For now, stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.